Hi there. So this book is The Wednesday Wars, and it was recommended to me by a sixth grade student here at Highland, and he said that this is like an awesome book. So I'm going to read it, a little bit of it, to my class here at Highland, Mrs. Ebarth's fifth grade class, and hopefully it'll make some of you want to purchase this throughout the Scholastic virtual book fair that they have going on. So I hope you enjoy it. It sounds like a pretty good book, so let's see what happens. It's The Wednesday Wars by Gary Schmidt. So chapter 1 starts out with September. Of all the kids in the 7th grade at Camillo Junior High, there was one kid that Mrs. Baker hated with heat whiter than the sun. Me. And let me tell you, it wasn't for anything I'd done. If it had been Doug Sweetek that Mrs. Baker hated, it would have made sense. Doug Sweetek once made up a list of 410 ways to get a teacher to hate you. It began with spray deodorant in all her desk drawers and got worse as it went along. A whole lot worse. I think things became illegal around number 167. You don't want to know what number 400 was. And you really don't want to know what number 410 was. But I'll tell you this much. They were the kinds of things that sent kids to juvenile detention homes in upstate New York so far away that you never saw them again. Doug Sweetek tried number 6 on Mrs. Sidman last year. It was something about Wrigley gum in the teacher's water fountain, which was just outside the teacher's lounge, and the Polynesian fruit blend hair coloring that Mrs. Sidman used. It worked, and streams of juice the color of mangoes stained her face for the rest of the day, and the next day, and the next day, until I suppose the skin cells wore off. Doug Sweetek was suspended for 2 whole weeks. Just before he left, he said that next year he was going to try number 166 to see how much time that would get him. The day before Doug Sweetek came back, our principal reported during morning announcements that Mrs. Sidman had accepted voluntary reassignment to the main administrative office. We were all supposed to congratulate her on the new post, but it was hard to congratulate her because she almost never peeked out of the main administrative office. Even when she had to be the playground monitor during recess, she mostly kept away from us. If you did get close, she'd whip out a plastic rain hat and put it on. It's hard to congratulate someone who's holding a plastic rain hat over her Polynesian fruit blend colored hair. See, that's what kind of stuff that gets teachers to hate you. But the thing was, I never did any of that stuff. Never. I even stayed as far away from Doug Sweetek as I could. So if he did decide to try number 166 on anyone, I wouldn't get blamed for standing nearby. But it didn't matter. Mrs. Baker hated me. She hated me a whole lot worse than Mrs. Sidman hated Doug Sweetek. I knew it on Monday, the first day of 7th grade, when she called the class roll, which told you not only who was in the class, but also where everyone lived. If your last name ended in Berg, or Zog, or Stein, you lived on the north side. If your last name ended in Ellie, or Innie, or O, you lived on the south side. Lee Avenue cut right between them, and if you walked out of Camillo Junior High and followed Lee Avenue across Main Street, past McLean's drugstore, Goldman's Best Bakery, and the 5 and 10 cent store, through another block and past the free public library, and down one more block, you'd come to my house, which my father had figured out was right smack in the middle of town. Not on the north side, not on the south side, just somewhere in between. It's the perfect house, he said. But perfect or not, it was hard living in between. Just somewhere in between. It's the perfect house, he said. But perfect or not, it was just hard living in between. On Saturday morning, everyone north of us was at Temple Beth El. Late on Saturday afternoon, everyone south of us was at Mass at St. Adalbert's, which had gone modern and figured that it didn't need to wake parishioners up early. But on Sunday morning, early, my family was at St. Andrew Presbyterian Church listening to Pastor McClellan, who was old enough to have known Moses. This meant that out of the whole weekend there was only Sunday afternoon left over for the full baseball teams. This hadn't been too much of a disaster up until now. But last summer, Ben Cummings moved to Connecticut so his father could work in Groton. And Ian McAllister moved to Biloxi so his father could be a chaplain at the base there instead of the pastor at St. Andrews, which is why we ended up with Pastor McClellan, who could have called Isaiah a personal friend too. So being a Presbyterian was now a disaster, especially on Wednesday afternoons when at 1:45 sharp, half of my class went to Hebrew school at Temple Bethel, and at 1:55, the other half went to catechism at St. Adalbert's. This left behind just the Presbyterians, of which there had been 3, and now there was 1. Me. I think Mrs. Baker suspected this when she came to my name on the class roll. Her voice got kind of crackly, like there was a secret code in the static underneath it. Howling, hood, she said. Here, I raised my hand. Hood? Yes. Mrs. Baker sat on the edge of her desk. This should have sent me some kind of message, since teachers aren't supposed to sit on the edge of their desks on the first day of class. There's a rule about that. Hood, she said quietly. She thought for a moment. Does your family attend Temple Bethel, she said. I shook my head. St. Adalbert's then, she asked this kind of hopefully. I shook my head again. So on Wednesday afternoon, you attend neither Hebrew school nor catechism. I nodded. You are here with me? I guess, I said. Mrs. Baker looked hard at me. I think she rolled her eyes. Since the mutilation of guess into an intransitive verb is a crime against the language, perhaps you might wish a full sentence to avoid prosecution. Something such as, I guess this Wednesday afternoons will be busy after all. That's when I knew that she hated me. This look came over her face like the sun had winked out and was not going to shine again until next June. And probably that's the same look that came over my face, since I felt the way you feel just before you throw up, cold and sweaty at the same time, and your stomach's doing things that stomachs aren't supposed to do, and you're really wishing that the ham and cheese and broccoli omelet that your mother made for you for the first day of school had been Cheerios, like you really wanted, but because they come up a whole lot easier and not yellow. If Mrs. Baker was feeling like she was going to throw up too, she didn't show it. She looked down at the class roll. Mai Thi Hung, she called. She looked up to find Mai Thi's raised hand and nodded. But before she looked down, Mrs. Baker looked at me again, and this time her eyes really did roll. Then she looked down again at her list. Daniel Hupfer? She called, and she looked up to find Danny's raised hand, and then she turned to look at me again. Mary Lee Kowalski, she called. She found Mary Lee's hand and looked again at me. She did this every time she looked up to find somebody's hand. She was watching me because she hated my guts. I walked back to the perfect house slowly that afternoon. I could always tell when I got there without looking up because the sidewalk changed. Suddenly, all the cement squares were perfectly white, and none of them had a single crack, not one. This was only true of the cement squares on the walkway leading up to the perfect house, which were bordered by perfectly matching azalea bushes, all at the same height, alternating between pink and white blossoms. The cement squares and azaleas stopped at the perfect stoop, 3 steps, like every other stoop on the block, and then you're up to the 2-story colonial, with 2 windows on each side, and 2 dormers on the second floor. It was like every other house on the block, except neater, because my father had it painted perfectly white every other year, except for the fake aluminum shutters, which were black, and the aluminum screen door, which gleamed dully and never ever squeaked when you opened it. Inside, I dropped my books on the stairs. Mom, I called. I thought about getting something to eat. A Twinkie maybe, then chocolate milk that had more chocolate than milk, and then another Twinkie. After all that sugar, I figured I'd be able to come up with something on how to live with Mrs. Baker for 9 months. Either that or I wouldn't care anymore. Mom, I called again. I walked past the perfect living room, where no one ever sat because all the seat cushions were covered in stiff, clear plastic. You could walk in there and think that everything was for sale. It was so perfect. The carpet looked like it had never been walked on, which it almost hadn't. And the baby grand by the window looked like it had never been played, which it hadn't, since none of us could. But if anyone had ever walked in and plinked a key or sniffed the artificial tropical flowers or straightened a tie in the gleaming mirror, they sure would have been impressed at the perfect life of an architect from Hood and Associates. My mother was in the kitchen, fanning air out the open window and putting out a cigarette, because I wasn't supposed to know that she smoked, and if I did know, I wasn't supposed to say anything, and I really wasn't supposed to tell my father. And that's when it came to me, even before the Twinkie. I needed to have an ally in the war against Mrs. Baker. "How was your day?" my mother said. "Mom," I said, "Mrs. Baker hates my guts." "Mrs. Baker doesn't hate your guts." She stopped fanning and closed the window. "Yes, she does. Mrs. Baker hardly knows you." "Mom, it's not like you have to know someone well to hate their guts. You don't sit around and have a long conversation and then decide whether or not you to hate their guts. You just do. And she does. I'm sure that Mrs. Baker is a fine person, and she certainly does not hate your guts." How do parents get to where they can say things like this? There must be some gene that switches on at birth at the firstborn child, and suddenly stuff like that starts to come out of their mouths. It's like they haven't figured out that the language you're using is English, and they should be able to understand what you're saying. Instead, you pull a string on them and a bad record plays. I guess they can't help it. Right after supper, I went to the den to look for a new ally. "Dad, Mrs. Baker hates my guts." "Can you see that the television is on and that I'm watching Walter Cronkite?" he said. We listened to Walter Cronkite report on the new casualty figures from Vietnam and how the air was being widened and how 2 new brigades of the 101st Airborne Division were being sent over until CBS finally threw in a commercial. "Dad, Mrs. Baker hates my guts." "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything. She just hates my guts." People don't just hate your guts unless you do something to them. So what did you do? "Nothing." "This is Betty Baker, right?" "I guess." "The Betty Baker who belongs to the Baker family?" See what I mean about the gene thing? They miss the entire point of what you're saying. "I guess she belongs to the Baker family," I said. "The Baker family that owns the Baker Sporting Emporium?" "Dad, she hates my guts." The Baker Sporting Emporium, which is about to choose an architect for its new building and which is considering Hood and Associates among its top 3 choices. "Dad, so Holling, what did you do that might make Mrs. Baker hate your guts, which will make other Baker family members hate the name of Hood, which will lead the Baker Sporting Emporium to choose another architect, which will kill the deal for Hood and Associates, which will drive us into bankruptcy, which will encourage several lending institutions around the state to send representatives to our front stoop holding papers that have lots of legal words on them, none of them good, and which will mean that there will be no Hood and Associates for you to take over when I'm ready to retire." Even though there wasn't much left of the ham and cheese and broccoli omelet, it started to want to come up again. "I guess things aren't so bad," I said. "Keep them that way," he said. This wasn't exactly what I had hoped for in an ally.